Now, designing sourdough recipes, well, it can be just a little bit tricky. Trying to work out the hydration for the starter, the leaven, and the dough makes things a little bit complicated, but if you break that process down into 5 key steps, it becomes a lot more straightforward and you can avoid making mistakes. Now, I'm going to share the process that I use to design my sourdough reboot recipe, and I'm going to uncover the trap that so many fall into. Now, while this formula is relatively simple, it lays the foundation for a vast majority of recipes. Okay, so let's zoom all the way out and we're going to break our sourdough recipe down into its main components. We've got our sourdough starter, then we've got our sourdough leaven, and of course, lastly, we have our dough. Now, each of these components has its very own recipe or formula. And when we add up all of the ingredients from the starter, the leaven, and the dough, we get what's called the total recipe formula. Now, when we design any sourdough recipe, we always start by calculating this total formula. And then afterwards, we can break it down into the separate components. You know, this gives us a great deal of control and it allows us to design these super complex recipes that use multiple sourdough cultures, pre-ferments, pre-doughs, soakers. You can include whatever you want. Now, I'm not going to lie, I barely ever do these calculations manually when I'm designing or tweaking recipes. I've got a shortcut that I'm going to share a little bit later, but knowing how these recipes are constructed is going to give you a much better insight into sourdough as a whole and recipe design. Now, in order to calculate this total formula, the first thing we need to know is how much dough are we going to be making. Now, to do this, I'm guided by the size of the banneton that I'm going to use to prove the dough and the amount of loaves that I'm going to be baking. Now, this basket, this one right here, holds 800 grams of dough perfectly when the dough's fully proved. And as I'm only going to be making one loaf, 800 grams of dough is going to be my target dough weight. Okay, so our second step is to use baker's percentages to work out the ingredients that we need to actually reach our target dough weight. Now, whenever we use baker's percentages to calculate a formula, the flour is always considered 100%, no matter the weight. And the weight of every other ingredient in the formula is calculated as a percentage of the flour. So the flour is really easy to work out, it's 100%. So now we can drop down to the hydration, which in this recipe is water. Now, this hydration percentage is going to depend on many factors: the product you're baking, the flour you're using, other ingredients, the climate, and of course your skill level. This is the variable that you're going to adjust more than any other when you're developing recipes. Now, for my reboot recipe, we're going to be working with a sensible hydration of 65%. Now, of course, lastly, we need to calculate the salt in the recipe. Now, generally speaking, anywhere between 1.8 to 2% of salt works perfectly in a recipe like this. Right, so now we've attributed the percentages, we just need to total those up because it's time to calculate the weights of the other ingredients. And to do that, we divide the dough weight by the total percentage and then we multiply it by the individual ingredient percentage. So let's start with the flour. We take the dough weight of 800 grams, we divide it by the total percentage, and then we multiply it by the percentage of flour. Now we do exactly the same with the water. Dough weight divided by total percentage multiplied by the water percentage. And of course, let's not forget our salt. Now, if we run down and total those up, you can see that we've hit our dough weight. So now it's time to break this down into its 3 separate components. We're going to calculate the leaven, the starter, and the dough. So the third step, we need to decide how much leaven we want to use in the main dough. Now, commonly, we can use anything between 10 to 30%, but for my reboot recipe, it requires 20% of leaven. Now, to calculate that, we multiply the total flour weight by 20%, and that gives us 96 grams of leaven. Now we break it down into its individual components. We've got our strong white bread flour, our water, and our sourdough starter. Now for our leaven formula, we're going to use equal quantities of each. So our flour is always 100%, so our water will be 100%, and so will our starter. We're going to use exactly the same formula to work out the weights. We've got our leaven weight divided by the total percentage multiplied by the ingredient percentage. And as we're using equal quantities, it's the same weight for each. Right, so step 4, we need to calculate the weights for our starter. Now our starter weighs in at 32 grams, so I follow exactly the same process again. Starter weight divided by total percentage multiplied by the ingredient percentage. Now, the first time I ever did this, I thought the whole thing was a bit overkill, but breaking a recipe down like this gives us complete control of the hydration at each stage. Right, so the last job, we need to calculate the ingredients that are going to make up our dough. So we take the total flour weight from the total formula, we subtract the flour we used in the leaven and the flour that we used in the starter. We do exactly the same with the water. The salt is carried straight over, and lastly we just add in our leaven. And of course, just for fun, we add up these weights, and if we've done our maths correctly, this should add up to our target dough weight of 800 grams. And there you have it, a sourdough recipe that's been broken down into its individual components: starter, leaven and dough. This process can be used to calculate super complex formulas, and once you've got the hang of it, the sky's the limit. So I know you're probably thinking, do I really need to break the recipe down into 3? Couldn't you just kind of include the leaven in the total ingredients? Well, you definitely wouldn't be alone in wondering this, but be warned, this is a common trap that is super easy to fall into. And while things kind of look great on the surface, when we actually dive deeper, things start to fall apart. So in this example, I've included that leaven in the total ingredients, and then I've calculated the weights using the magic formula. But I've got no way of knowing what hydration the leaven is. I haven't even got any way to adjust it. And even if I made an educated guess that it's 100% hydrated, we start to run into some serious issues. Because when we actually break the leaven down and we total the weights of the flour and the water, we find out that the hydration is actually 68% and not 65. Now I know what you're thinking, 3% is not a lot, but it makes a huge difference to a beginner baker, and when you start to reach that saturation point of the flour that you're using. If we're going to go to the trouble of designing a recipe properly, we might as well make sure that we are calculating it accurately. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, this is actually my beginner's reboot formula, and this is the loaf that recipe produces. Now, while this formula only uses 3 ingredients, as you get more experienced at recipe design, you can include complex flour blends, multiple liquids, and multiple inclusions. There are 0 limits to what's possible. Now, while I love baker's maths just about as much as the next person, this is a long process to go through every time you want to calculate or adjust a recipe. So to save myself time and streamline my process, I created a recipe calculator that uses this exact process. And when I use that, I can calculate a formula like this in less than 30 seconds and with no danger of making any mistakes, and I don't fry my brain. But understanding the math that's behind the process will help you dive deeper. This video just scratches the surface of recipe design. So let me know what else you'd like me to cover. Take care and stay tuned.